Alrighty. So, I just got done watching a video on Weird Bike about Dan Gurney's alligator, and then I remembered about my single cylinder um, YouTube video, and that was that was really enlightening because it was like, oh, so I'm not the only one that thought about like having a bike similar. Mine's different in that the bike's engine is actually behind the person sitting inside of the motorcycle. That's right, it's not in front, it's behind the guy sitting. So there's that. Excuse me. Anyways, I had to talk with my dog there for a second. He was biting the hell out of my arm. Um, but yeah, no, okay, so it's a single cylinder, but it's a different type of single cylinder because, of course, I use my injector technology that injects air. Like I talked about my recent how to use nitrogen filters in internal combustion engine applications that are high flow and can handle up to 120 psi with 60 C degree intakes. So, normally you wouldn't really want to do it, mostly because of the detonation, right? But if you place in fuel at first and a little bit of oxygen, it'll burn. There's an extra amount of fuel there that you can then inject more air after top dead center, which was what my single cylinder engine video talked about. Then it's a hybrid air and liquid cooling. So the liquid cooling would be in the front of the person who's sitting. It would then be diverted around and underneath the people's legs that are, of course, riding the motorcycle, but also down and through into the intake of, well, not the intake, but the heatsink fins of the engine itself. Air shroud stuff, but then they're really just sort of structural parts of the bike frame, just like the bike's engine is as well. As you kind of need that to be there to be able to get that kind of performance out of the engine I was looking for, because it was going to rev to 9,000 RPM, be at 15 psi with a super turbo, and burn effectively gas and oxygen in combo with a ability to accelerate the piston, the mass, right, for a longer duration because it has a longer stroke. Now, a longer stroke length means a longer amount of duration of acceleration, which means more force, with a girdle and a offset type of crank that actually makes it act like it's actually just in line, because I have an elbow pin. So where the connecting rod connects, there's a girdle, and then it connects that connecting rod point, like a double wrist pin, to the offset crank. It has a bottomer as well, and it sends the exhaust into the bottom of the single cylinder. Now, you could burn more air and fuel into the bottom of the cylinder. I didn't do it. It was never necessary because I was able to get 350 foot-pounds of torque, because it was a 1.2 liter single cylinder that has balancing of the Formula One's style of inertial dampening suspension for its counterweight, and a harmonic balancer oil pump for its crankshaft, which just happens to spin it at the right time to pump for the harmonic balancing side to side, which is a gearing to the crankshaft, and then the inertial dampening for its counterweight works just fine as a obvious counterweight. It's also a coolant pump, just like the oil pump harmonic balancer can also be. So the difference also would be that I use rotating bearing journal style valves that are cooled with oil, because of course that's not impossible, obviously. And then it's a kind of cone gear, and a oddly shaped one at that allows for it to act on a 4-stroke cycle, be closed and then open when necessary. Same thing for the bottom of the cylinder that would rotate as exhaust would come in on one side. It would then go off to a super turbo. I then had a nitrogen filter that would pump it off into, of course, the bottom of the cylinder after I draw a vacuum in a crankcase and head, and then dump it off into the turbine of the turbo during its power stroke. Capture a little bit more of that energy. Anyways, 350 foot-pounds was achieved also because the turbine of the super turbo would dump its energy into the crank of the engine, making it more efficient, which is good because I wanted that. Anyways, point is, all that really meant is because it's super hot, I had to do a hybrid cooling system, right? It's shaped such that it's better able to take more of the air coming in to more evenly disperse and spread out its heat over the body of the engine, but also use liquid cooling at the front as well to help. I also happen to have the nitrogen filter there, the air-to-air, liquid-to-air into the nitrogen, and then the nitrogen also has to be cooled too, turns out. But also from the nitrogen, I have to have that go back to an air-to-air and then to another liquid-to-air. I'm probably able to get away with simply just doing a liquid-to-air, meaning liquid cooling into the nitrogen and liquid cooling after, and then a standard radiator for the single cylinder. Yeah, but I just wanted to be extra sure because that was my concept prototype idea. Anyways, the transmission is essentially a pack of different CVT gearing, which means it's a bunch of rings that have balls in them, and I can also use cones in between the rings. Well, balls are literally what they are, is just altering its gearing ratio based upon that, but that means I can make it really tight and small, okay, and compact directly from the crankshaft. What that meant was that my rear wheel could have a suspension arm that could connect directly, effectively speaking, to the transmission and the exhaust manifold, which would have a little raised up part to hold the rear second passenger as well seat. Now, mine was built to make it such that you can lean back and have the handlebars further back like monkey bars or monkey handlebars, so you can recline in a seating position, and you can be quite a bit far forward because I'm a tall guy, and then I have a big, I forget what it's called, but the windscreen basically. The problem is that the second person happens to be sitting essentially right above the single cylinder, and it looks a little bit like a dick. I'm not gonna lie, it looks a little bit like a penis. It's a single cylinder. There's an offset crank off to the one side off to the right if you're looking rear to front, and then there's a turbine for the super turbo and the charger. Right? Yeah. It's on to the charger's more off to the right again, or left, but that means it looks very much like two round parts and then a long shaft. So, looks a little bit like a penis. It's quite phallic. So, but that person can sit there, and while they don't recline as much, they recline a little bit, but they're definitely above where the person who's the driver is. And basically the legs are going to come up to where the gas tank is. That's where they would rest them. There's like this little armchair rest thing that was there, and then that would be where the extra, further legs to ultimately rest would be. Now, the gas tank is, of course, where the handlebars are, right? The seats happen to be structural in a way, but they also happen to have batteries in them. And the ECU. There are also suspension padding seats, which is fine. It has more than enough cooling for what it's worth. It's a soft tail with a good fork with a further forward rake than average. And it's not a super, super long wheelbase, but it's a decently long wheelbase, but not that much. It's average, just a little bit longer than average, that kind of thing. Yeah. That's what it was for, and then it was meant to look a little bit like the Alligator for like the sport bike, but it's more like a sport touring cruiser. Right? Because you're going to be going quite low to the ground. Now, the exhaust is taken care of by the fact that it basically comes out right where the turbo is, which means it basically gets angled right up underneath the second passenger seat, and then it goes above the wheel, which happens to have its own little fender, so that way it doesn't get melted by anything. And in its own right, it's basically just a bunch of flat pack. It's a flat muffler and then a high flow resonator and high flow glass pack resonator combo into like a little tip that's another type of muffler. Everything's basically got a bunch of heatsink fins on it and a little bit of structural support, so that way it cools off the exhaust, so it's emissions compliant. It's not going to make nitric oxides anymore. And then it also, because of the diffusing tip and the air that also has shrouds to help push into it, means that it helps further cool the exhaust and dampen a large amount of the sound. And we also have a recycling of that exhaust as it gets to the glass pack back into the flat pack muffler. That's why it looks so big and thick. It's because it has a lot of that going on, so it recycles this exhaust into the exhaust intake near it. Not the same place, but near it. Then as air goes through, it then cools itself off at the tip as it'll join more air in to where the tip is, which is more of a muffler tip than anything, right? And so now it won't be nearly as loud, which is fine. That was kind of the point. It's supposed to be 55 dB, but it will also be very, very low baritone, roary roar breath, like Now, it was supposed to be 350, but this is engine management stuff, which means I'm toning it back down. I can easily get a constant 350. I don't want a constant 350 because it goes up to 9,000 damn RPM, and it's balanced to 28,000 RPM. And it comes with injectors that can do it from the start, and a fuel pump that can do it from the start, and all the rest of it. Except, of course, the ECU goes, "Hey, are you sure?" And he goes, "Okay, are you really sure?" And then I'm going to talk about all of what it is that you just agreed to, and I'm going to highlight it in yellow while saying it out loud. And then I'm going to have you go through a nice little teaching, education, multiple choice question so you really know what you're agreeing to, all while static plays and so on. But 3, and you're in, and you can just unlock it to 28K from factory. It's got a nice little dash. A lot of people tend to like the analog. I'm also one of those people. I do like analog gauges. I don't know what it is. There's just something nice about analog gauges sometimes. But that being said, I also have a digital. So I have a digital and analog gauge cluster. There's a digital area, and then there's a couple of analog style of gauges. That way it looks cool to me. And I have a singular, just the one, light. It's a donut shape at the front. It's got a hole in the center of the donut, and then a hole like a scramjet around the sides of the donut. It's shaped such that it helps force in some more air, and that is where the ram air that goes to the super turbo happens to be. That way it's more efficient. It's a Ram Super Turbo. Now the Super Turbo, of course, turns off at the right RPM. It's the supercharger part is actually on a CVT clutch and solenoid setup, so that way it starts off at a larger gear, then it immediately drops down to a smaller gear. That way it always has roughly the same amount of pressure, PSI, that I'm looking for. Okay, and then once it gets to the right RPM, it then disengages and then goes to the turbo, which is how super turbos work, right? Except that's also another reason why the crank part is there. I don't want it to go above a certain RPM, so it'll start taking over the alternator, it'll start taking over the pumps and everything, and then it'll dump it into the crank. That way it's far more efficient and far more powerful because it reduces parasitic loss until eventually it will just add in its torque. The ECU is dynamic, which means it knows the airspeed and pressure it's at, it knows the gear you're in, and it knows the engine RPM that you're at, which means the air-fuel map sensor or map and timing for ignition and all that changes. Because, of course, you can't have it actually at just before top dead center because it's a detonation level velocity gas with oxygen in it, which means you need to retard timing quite a decent amount, but because you're continuing to accelerate it for a lot longer, that means you can gain that torque back quite a bit more, which is why it's 350 foot-pounds of torque, but then it's only 300 horsepower. Not because it can't remain at 350 foot-pounds of torque, only because it can't ultimately be super safe maintaining that. Kind of horsepower. I just happen to be one of those people that has that type of mentality. It has a dynamic engine mapping, which I was talking about, but that also means it can also go down to about 50 to maybe 150, really, in terms of the low eco mode and the amount of air and fuel you'll use and the pressures you'll be at. Okay, which means it's very forgiving for beginners because it's a single cylinder, which only has, for a 4-stroke cycle, 1 power stroke. That, while has great torque because it's a multiple CVT gear pack system, it means it's very easy to be in a higher gear at a slightly higher RPM and give it a decent amount of throttle and slowly take off without fearing for your life in terms of how you might buck and land on the ground behind you. Especially when the engine is essentially that far back and you are that far forward inside of the motorcycle, which it is inside of the motorcycle. It is in between 2 fairly darn large tires. They are a rather standard sized, I think it was 16-inch rims or something like that, 14, 16, something like that. Slightly larger in the rear than it is in the front to a degree. I think it was like a fucking inch or something, but I don't know. I wanted to get the same ones. It's just for what it was worth. But I made it such that the sidewall was slightly larger. It's the same size tire, but the sidewall was larger as a result for the front, so it'd be more comfortable, which was the whole point of it. But they are wide boys, so like if it was 4 inches in the rear, it was 5 inches in the front for the sidewall. Now the tread width, okay, is consistently 5 inches, but that doesn't take into account the roundness, which I think was 8 inches, something like that, 8.5, something like that. Right? And it's all because it was like, well, I have more than enough torque to do it, and also it's really meant to be more of a cruiser, putting around that you can take onto a track and genuinely belt it around the track and have a fun time, but really meant to just go cross country, like across the country kind of thing, and enjoy yourself, especially when the exhaust is essentially so high up and it has a fairly high, bottom that you could probably even get away with like some potholes or even some adventure, slight kind of touring, not like actually genuinely going around and jumping things. It's not really meant for that, clearly. But, you could take it on a trail. It's not too bad. You could probably get there just fine. But that was the whole point of that given concept as a actual like motorcycle. The power to the wheel was done with a kind of differential, independent link suspension that was also a part, because of the axle housing, of the Softail for the rear wheel. It also happened to have a type of CVT gearing system, kind of like a cone to cone with a ball from the transmission. That way, you could dump your clutch and not have it try and yank you up so high. You can adjust your spring and shock tension, which was in the very few amount of tubes that existed for the frame. Now there is a frame, but when the transmission, the axle housing for your rear wheel, your gas tank, your seats, and all of it are effectively structural members, you got to figure out a place to put all that somehow. So shock and spring are effectively structural members inside some of the tubes of the frame. which was a good thing because that was much more compact as a result, and then it weighed a lot less, and it was a lot less likely to be incredibly annoying to actually have to use or get to, because it was more of a screw out and then bolt kind of thing. So, anyways, that was the leaning back motorcycle single cylinder. That's like the reclining, that is like a tour cruiser thing. That was like the Alligator from Dan Gurney, which is pretty cool. I like it, for what it's worth. So there's that. And then the other one was effectively the equivalent of a drag racing type of style bike. So they lean very far forward. They basically lay on their chests on the drag racing bikes that they have, right? But it's fairly similar. I mean, it's not, you are leaning on your chest, but you're not laying flat, effectively. This is what a lot of them do. You still have to put your legs back up into the rear, and you are leaning forward, but there are no two seats, there's just the one. And just like the Alligator, I had a saddle seat, same thing for the driver and rear passenger kind of style. It was much nicer in terms of like you not having certain parts be squished to hell, which is nice. But the other part of it for the laying down one is essentially the same thing, except I think I bumped it to 11K, the same engine, right? And I lightened up some of the parts, right? And then I changed some of the under, because you're still going to be leaning pretty far forward. So instead of having the engine such that it was behind you, now it's back to where it's in its own normal position. But now you have a saddle in the rear that you lay against, and then you have a big old chest thing, and you have these shoulder, pad areas that you hook your shoulder areas in. You put your head through. Right? So, that, and you're very far in between both the wheels. Oh, right, I didn't say the size of the wheels. Thank you. Those were 26 inches to 32s, depending on what type you wanted. Well, for what's worth, if it was a 5-inch in the front, it was a 16-inch rim. You could see where I'm probably off on that, so the rims were most likely larger. But yeah, that's basically why, because I'm a big, tall guy, and I was like, yeah, no, I definitely want them to be thicker sidewalls, and they're supposed to be really nice and comfortable. But then it's like, all right, but if you have this one, it's like they're bigger wheels, they're wide and fat, but they only have 3 inches sidewall front and rear. But they're 5-inch tread. Big hunkers. But they are, of course, having to do the rim thing, and so that means they're a little bit smaller, but I still want them to be fairly big because I want you to fit in between. That's where the saddle is in the rear, and why it's so low to the ground, and why you still lean onto the gas tank. And while, yes, you are looking up, you can also look down because I have a reverse mirror system. That's right. I have a mirror system so you can look through the mirror up through the front with a little tiny windscreen. Well, it's fairly much smaller than the other one, but it's still there, so that way you can make a very aerodynamic shape occur. It's very teardrop, right? I still have cooling and liquid and all that I talk about, but that was the concept for that one, where it's like now I can lean very far forward, but I'm also very deep in between the two wheels, and I can still feel like, in this instance, it's more like a cafe racer with how low to the body of the chassis the handlebars are, right? So it made a lot more sense to do it that way. So that way the aerodynamics and the center of gravity were better, and the comfort was better for people that wanted to use it as a sports bike, like an actual sports bike. Because then you can, instead of scrunch forward and all this, you can lean and be a lot more comfortable. But then you can also lean really deep into a turn and get yourself into trouble most of the time because of how far over you really can go doing that, especially with my big fat wheels I give you. But that was the whole point of it. It was supposed to be a really, really fun little bike that you could really have a blast taking a corner and shooting down in a straight line with, or even cruise around just fine for long periods of time. The only problem being if you're constantly leaning forward, you might get a little too comfortable and maybe fall asleep. So don't do that. Uh, and those were the only real two concept parts or concept designs I had in my head for these bikes. Because it's like, well, those are probably the best ways to do those bikes. And while convention is like this, I don't care about convention. These are better. That's what that is. Like, this is a better tour. This is a better sports bike. This is just better. It's more efficient and it's better missions. It's better in sound. Everything about it's better. So that's really all it turned into. The real issue is that most people would probably. The guy said it's like, well, because it wasn't, the conservative styling of, all the motorcyclists out there and what they would like. And I'm like, yeah, no, okay, cool. Whatever, bro. Don't care. Whatever floats your boat there, bro. Meanwhile, me, brap on out. As long as I'm having fun. I'm pretty sure it'd sell pretty darn well, though, for what it's worth. Alrighty. Have a good one. Like and subscribe. Bye.